Stephanie and David. It's great to be here with both of you to have a conversation that I know will be exciting and insightful about Stephanie's book, The Church Cracked Open, and about the amazing moment that, amazing, peculiar, wonderful moment that we are currently experiencing in the life of the church. I have a very general question to start us out with, which goes to just the title of the book, The Church Cracked Open. Stephanie, I'm wondering if you could speak about the ways in which you, in your role, are personally experiencing this cracking open of the church. Where do you see that happening as you work across the Episcopal Church?
Yeah, I mean, I think that honestly, Miguel, and first of all, thank you. Thanks to you, thank you, David, thank you to the team who are making conversations like this happen. I'm such an admirer of your canon, Sandy Millian, and of course of your bishop. So just thank you for being a part of these conversations. I feel like I've been watching this church cracking open, and certainly seeing the fissures and the kind of the breaks, and then seeing people trying to like shove things back together again. I feel like I've been seeing that for most of my time as an Episcopalian, which now is about 20 years. And a lot of that was because of decline. A lot of that is because of just these partial awakenings that had been happening everywhere, where it seemed like our association with establishment, with empire, our church's kind of arrogant stance in the world, acting as if we've got it all figured out, and and everybody else would be lucky to be an Episcopalian. Like you hear a lot of that. You're like, someday the rest of Christianity will evolve to be like us. Like that, I feel like that's the church I walked into 20 years ago, and it has been cracking open since then. We have been humbled, we have been chastened, but then came the pandemic, and I kind of feel like a lot of the changes, a lot of the breaking, a lot of the wrestling that many of us have been waiting to see happen in a profound way in our church, a lot of what we expected to come 20 years from now, maybe if we were lucky 10 years from now, suddenly came in this rush. That for instance, the Association of Church and Building. And, like if you were to do a little survey, of a group of Christians, and especially a group of Episcopalians, and ask them, what is church? Most folk would start out with, something like, well, it's the building. So suddenly it's like crack, it's not the building. You can't simply say that church is this edifice that you've invested so much time and so much love and so much money in. Now church has to be something else. Scramble, scramble. What does that mean for us? But then also the cracking open that I think we've seen around race, that there are a lot of folk in the Episcopal Church right now who are, I think of, for instance, the stories that we now have heard that we cannot unhear about the Indigenous boarding schools. And as like if you were to go to our friends in Canada, like there are clergy in Canada right now who are going on, like they're going on Twitter and on Facebook and Instagram, and they're making a demonstration of taking off their collars, because for them, they can no longer represent this church the same way. That's, that understanding of church and the embeddedness of our church in white supremacy. I think a lot of people probably thought, well, we're the good guys. And now they're having to wrestle with, what is our identity if we're not the good guys? And so that's been cracked open too. So there's just a lot that's crumbled around us and is now kind of on the floor. And we get to decide what we pick back up and what we use to reconstruct ourselves as the people of God, as the body of Christ. And that's a question for discernment. I find that exciting. A lot of folk, I think, are terrified by it. Many people want to pretend that we're not as cracked open as we are, right? and then at some point we can get back to dot, dot, dot. I'm excited at the thought that we could take this opening, this opportunity, and become what God was calling us to be all along.
I like your image. When I read it in the book, it was really, really telling for me about having the pieces on the floor. Because I think when people think of the church breaking down in the way that you describe it, they think of it as going away, that there's nothing left, that it's empty, there's nothing. And that's never been the case in the church.
Oh.
And one of the things that intrigued me in reading your book was also the parallel with the thoughts of people like Phyllis Tickle, who basically says, the church goes through this periodically. And in some ways, it can be a purification. It can be it's always a realignment. And it causes us to think about the very thing that you really focus on is, who are we really? And that's really, I think, where I think we need to be right now. And I think the pandemic, you have such a much more romantic image talking about the cracked jar of alabaster than I do, because I've been talking about it in our parish community as ripping the scab off, in the sense that it's just like, it's taking what we thought was really sort of okay and healing and doing well, and really showing how hurt we really are. And I think that's what the pandemic has revealed for a lot of people. I think that's true, not only in the church, but in our society as well. And I think that's why we're so anxious at this moment, because we don't know where it's going.
That is, everything you've said is so true. It's true on the ground where you are. And I think it's true at a macro level as well. That I find it's kind of fun to talk to people about the different metaphors that speak to this moment for them. For me, it was definitely that story in the Gospels of the woman with the alabaster jar. The woman who breaks in, like she really does. She breaks in to a dinner filled with men. Women didn't do that, and she doesn't just like anoint Jesus, or whatever. Like she actually breaks open this precious jar with precious ointment and pours it over her precious Lord. And Jesus doesn't ask for it. He could have easily smacked her away. Certainly the other men at the table wish he would. They're horrified by the whole scene. And at least for me, there was something really powerful about that image, the anxiety that it produced, I think, in the men in that room, but also the courage that it took for that woman to do this, and the love that drove her to do this, right? That sometimes when you're maybe on the edgy part of the church, or on the edgy side of the church, people tend to accuse those of us who are pressing for this new life. They accuse us of not loving the church. Like, that's just not true. Like, I love this church. I love it so much that I want to tell the truth about it.
Yes.
I love this church so much that I believe it can bear hearing the truth, that it won't just disappear, but that there will always be something that God brought together and that God wants to work with. And that we're going to have to break some stuff open, to crack some things open in order to get at the intentions of God, to get at the good stuff, that healing nard that's been almost trapped in that jar. So there are a lot of metaphors, and some of them can lean toward, like they can trigger people, I think, and that makes sense because loss is painful, and talking about losses, talking about breaking or cracking things open, like it's a romantic image on one hand, and yet it's a pretty unforgiving image, that things I love are in pieces around me, that's painful. That's painful.
Connected to this, I think one of my questions has to do with just, Stephanie, you write and speak often about just the connection between Episcopal identity, whiteness, and empire. And I want to just read one sentence that you wrote and then sort of ask a follow-up to that. You said, in many of these churches, you're speaking about denomination, including my own Episcopal church, it's difficult to differentiate between what is holy and essential and what is actually racial, cultural, and class preference. White identity and dominant American Christianity have been poured and blended into the same jar, and together they serve the purposes of empire. My question is, swum around in that jar for quite some time. How do you see what the church, or what do you have to say to a church that's trying to now start separating that out, about what is essential versus what is class preference versus what is simply WASP identity? Let's wonder if you have additional thoughts on that.
That discernment, to me, is some of the most important work for us as Episcopalians. I think it will have repercussions for us around evangelism. It will have repercussions around our justice work. It will have repercussions around just how we do ministry day in, day out. It will have repercussions for how we worship. Essentially, every part of Episcopal life is, at least right now, literally colored. It has been colored white. And that whiteness has been kind of masking, or in a way has masqueraded as holiness, as worthy of authority. This idea that certain people look the part. And I think that even for too long, even when people of color, or women for that matter, have stepped into authority, we've had to kind of still act the part or prove that we could, if called upon to do so. I'm very clear that the reason I am able to do what I do in this church, like a big part of it, is because I don't speak or present the way that most of my family in a small town in Kentucky does. That I went to a high school where a lot of my peers were the white children of professors. And even though my mom was a secretary working for those professors, like I got to be in that ilk. And so I learned a lot about how they moved in the world. And I went to friends' homes, and I still remember sitting at Gail, or God, I can't remember her last name, Gail Griffin's home. And for the first time sitting, like we were doing homework, her parents were listening to NPR. And then she was practicing cello. Like, like there was nothing in my family life to prepare me for anything like that. But I feel like because I was in Gail Grimm's house growing up, I can now sit in the parlor in some Episcopal, rector's home and, talk about NPR and talk about, oh, the children playing cello. I can pass, and even when I choose not to pass, I think people let me because they know that I can still slip back into the white code. So I have no illusions about why I get to do what I do. None at all. None at all. So how do we separate that out? Is there any possibility for us as an Episcopal church to be able to make room for Black folk who don't do white code, for Latino folk who don't do white code? Is there any way of recognizing the holiness of cultures that are not participating in whiteness. And again, right now, that's an open question for us. You know, we say yes, we say we want this to be the case, but then the moment we go into General Convention, you know, there'll be battles about what Episcopal liturgy looks like, what Episcopal music sounds like, and who gets to decide, you know, and there'll be these like star chambers put together, you know, of people who were educated enough and have again mastered white code enough that they can decide what is appropriate for the rest of us. As long as those structures still operate, it's just talk. And we're still embedded in whiteness, and whiteness is embedded in us. And we haven't yet separated out what is of God and what is of empire.
Yeah, just to echo and respond to that, I mean, I think one of the questions that sort of way I wrestle with this is just, you know, so much of Anglicanism is wrapped up in Anglo, being
Yes. Mm-hmm.
and yet in this respect, the Episcopal Church is out of step with the global Anglican Communion.
How about that?
All Anglo, right? The broader global Anglican Communion. So I hear in your book just a call to live into that broader international consciousness as well, and redefine a version of Anglicanism that is not centered in white English and Anglophilic identity.
And let's also work with our companions throughout the Anglican Communion to dislodge the Anglophilia that lives throughout that empire. I was just in a meeting earlier this week with Bishop Curry and some other folk, and someone mentioned that the Episcopal Church is the only part of the Anglican Communion, the only constituent in the Anglican Communion, not a part of the Commonwealth. So to say that it's a global church is true, but it's still very much, at least, you know, many of the expressions of Anglicanism throughout the globe or across the globe are still very embedded in empire as well. I've been heartened by the number of colleagues throughout the communion who've reached out to me about Church Cracked Open and said, we need our own version of this to tell the truth about how we are also, like, we may be, you know, like for instance, the church in Jamaica. Like we may be, or Barbados, or you name it, a church that is all, or that is by and large people of color. And people of color are rising in those systems, often based on their affinity for Anglo culture, based on their mastery of whiteness, still, even with no white person around to enforce it. So that's real. That's real too. And that's the way empire works. Like that is exactly what empires want to do. Like it was a successful experiment. Like now Black people throughout the Caribbean are wrestling to prove who can perform whiteness better than England can. That's partly because, and this is something I say in the book, and it's a hard one for folk, and it was a hard one for me to write, but that I'm not convinced that we were founded to be as a church that forms followers of Jesus. The evidence suggests to me that we were actually founded to be an institution that forms subjects of empire, and that church was an instrument for that domination project. That's the Episcopal story.
I think you're right in a lot of ways that way, because I've heard it said, and I've repeated this in a different context several times, that the Anglican Communion is really the last vestige of the British Empire.
Precisely.
Because the Commonwealth itself is still a communion of sorts, but of independent nations. Mm-hmm. But one of the things, for example, when I teach in the Stevenson School is really, because I teach canon law of all things. Oh my gosh, you know, that there's actually a course in canon law. But one of the things I try to disabuse people of is that, the Archbishop of Canterbury has absolutely no jurisdiction in the Episcopal Church. And they really have taken on the mantle of that, that everything goes back to England and everything goes back to, Canterbury and so on, which there's a long tradition of that. And there's a lot to be valued in that. But at the same time, on a practical level, it has no practical value for us. And in fact, keeps us from moving forward effectively in new ways, because we're trying to make sure that we're still part of that. And, whenever we do that, and I think that speaks a little bit to what you're saying about the Caribbean church, that people are trying to still remain part of this big thing that, seemed to be so good on many levels. And I think part of it is sort of in our DNA. I mean, it actually does go that deeply into our spiritual DNA, as it were, because it's what we knew, it's what we did. And so in order to become as powerful as the previous imperial powers, we have to become just like them.
Right.
And that's where the sin comes in, I think, in a lot of ways.
Kwok Wheelan, brilliant theologian who I think now is associated with Emory, but was one of my professors at Episcopal Divinity School. She often wrote about privilege by association, and that throughout the empire / communion, that you would see, and she writes just brilliant kind of vignettes, almost like she paints pictures for you of what these gatherings of Anglican leaders look like, when even though the faces are the faces of people of color, the way they dress, the way they hold themselves, the way they speak, refer to each other as my Lord or your grace or etc., that it's all kind of playing out this English, this kind of English, not just an English tableau, but even kind of an English like aristocratic tableau, and that's kind of what our church is patterned on. And for me, like, it's never just a matter of pointing to these things and saying, "Ooh, bad church," but it's saying, how do these practices, how do these behaviors, how does this history prevent us from following the living God right now, the God who has her arms extended to us, his hands extended to us, their hearts extended to us, that God. And we have a hard time responding because we're so busy clinging to this other thing that we've been told was church, that we've been told was Christianity. And God bless us, we believed it. Like, to me, I feel like it's a failure of formation as much as it is, the victory of racism, that we were told church is this thing. And now my prayer is that the main part of what gets cracked open is, you thought that was church. It wasn't. But it could be. And I live for that part, but it could be. But we
Right.
could yet become the thing, Verna Dozier, talking about, she sees the church as it is and says, like, we are not the kingdom of God, but living on the earth, but we could become this by the power of the Spirit if we're following Jesus. And so that's what gets me excited. That's what gets me up in the morning. It's like, what could this church be if we channeled so much of what we were directing into preserving our buildings and preserving certain structures and certain marks of how we are, all of us together. And like, if clergy didn't have, certain authority, but instead it was spread around to the rest of the people of God, if we could let so many of those things crack open, what could God do with us? Don't you wonder?
Yeah.
Like, I wonder about that. I pray about that. And to me, that's what drives this whole process. It's not glee and like, ha ha, ding dong, the witch is dead. It's not like that. It's now, can we be the thing that God created us to be as individuals, as congregations, as a whole denominational body. And for some reason, God has given me a heart for this denominational body. I know it doesn't really matter, but it's us, it's family. So this family that we're in, this Episcopal branch of the Jesus movement.
Right.
How about that? How do we become that?